Hello, and welcome to We Live for Saturday, your favorite college football podcast. Normally, I'm your co host, Mike, but tonight, or today, I guess I should say, I'm just your host, Mike. John and also our potential guest host had conflicts, so it's just me. So this will be a little shorter than usual podcast, just because, I can only talk to myself so much. So I'm glad you're with us. Thanks for listening. And just FYI, John will be back for the next podcast. So don't worry, it won't be just me. And also, sorry, this is a belated podcast. I've been out of town all week and I had some personal things come up. So I apologize to all of you for recording this so late. Next week, we will be back on a normal podcast schedule. So like I said, this will be a shorter than usual pod. Just because John wasn't available and I couldn't find a guest host for this week who was able to do it. That said, we're going to have some fun. So let's preview these Week 12 Big Ten games. First off, Friday, November 15th, we have 4-5 UCLA, going to 5-5 Washington. This is an 8 p.m. game on Fox. The line is Washington by 4.5. Excuse me. So after an extremely rough start to the season, UCLA has righted the ship. The Bruins have won 3 games in a row against Rutgers, Nebraska, and most surprisingly, Iowa. UCLA did a fantastic job shutting down star Iowa running back Caleb Johnson in that game. So the question is, will UCLA be able to slow down star Washington running back Jonah Coleman? Coleman has been fantastic this year and is nearing 1,000 yards at an impressive nearly 6 yards per carry. Coleman also has 7 TDs on the season. Washington got an emotional win over USC a couple weeks ago, but then got throttled by Penn State last week, 35-6. Against Penn State, Washington only managed an abysmal 193 yards for the game. Woof. Look for Washington and enigmatic QB Will Rogers to try to bounce back in this one. That is, if he gets the start. Rogers got pulled against Penn State and gave way to dynamic backup QB Damon Williams. Williams brings an extremely different dimension to the offense with his legs, but I'm not sure if he's an upgrade over Will Rogers as a passer. I'm not convinced of that at all. So it'll be interesting to see if Washington goes with one or the other, or if they use both QBs in this game. And as always, it'll be important for Washington to get the ball to top receivers, Giles Jackson and Denzel Boston. For UCLA, QB Ethan Garbers has really excelled the past few weeks and is playing with a lot of confidence. He's completing a decently high percentage of his passes. It will be up to the Washington defense to put pressure on Garbers and force him off his spot so he can't just pick them apart. UCLA running back TJ Harden had his first 100-plus yard game against Iowa for the season. Can he do it on the road again against Washington? I'm somewhat skeptical just because Washington seems to play a lot better at home than they do on the road. And I think it comes down to that. UCLA is on a hot streak, but they are still very gettable for good teams. I think this will be a very close game. But ultimately, I think the home field advantage helps buoy Washington to a close victory. So I am predicting the Washington Huskies 27, the UCLA Bruins 24. And also, I didn't address this earlier, but if you are wondering what the background is, I'm not quite home yet. I'm between where my trip was. I'm actually staying in my hometown of Fargo with my parents at their place right now. And as soon as I get done recording and posting this podcast, I will be heading back to Minneapolis. But that's why the background is different today. So if you were wondering about that, that's the story there. Next up, and all the rest of these games will be played on Saturday, November 16th. We have the number 2, 8-1 Ohio State Buckeyes going to Evanston to take on the 4-5 Northwestern Wildcats. This is an 11 a.m. game on the Big Ten Network, and the line is Ohio State by 29. It's been a long season for Northwestern, who plays decent defense to their credit, but the Wildcats struggle to score points. After getting blown out by Wisconsin and Iowa, the Cats managed to beat a hapless Purdue team last week, but it took overtime to do it. By contrast, The Buckeyes had a too close for comfort win against Nebraska a few weeks ago. And since then, they won a tight game at Penn State. No shame in that. Good for the Buckeyes winning that game. And then they sent a message shutting out Purdue emphatically 45-0. The Buckeyes have not been as consistent as I expected them to be, particularly on offense. But that said, it's possible they are rounding into form for the stretch run of the season. The problem for the Cats is just that Northwestern has largely been terrible on offense. QB Jack Lausch has completed just 53% of his passes, while running back Cam Porter only has 387 yards rushing for the entire season. On the flip side, Ohio State has what I believe is the best defense in the country. And on offense, they have playmakers like running backs Henderson and Judkins, wide receivers Emeka Egbuka and Jeremiah Smith, and other guys have also stepped up in recent weeks. So even if it's not those two top receivers, the Buckeyes have crazy depth with, Tate and Innis and all of it. So I just don't see how Northwestern scores enough points to be competitive in this one. I think this game will be over by halftime, if not earlier. I think that the Buckeyes are just on a mission right now, and you're going to see them try to improve every week until they get to the potential rematch with Oregon in the Big Ten title game. So I have the Ohio State Buckeyes 41, the Northwestern Wildcats 7. Next up, we have the 4-5 Michigan State Spartans heading to Champaign to take on the 6-3 Illinois Illini. This is a weirdly timed 1:30 p.m. game on FS1, which is strange as usually the time slots are 11 a.m. and then 2:30 or 3. But this is a 1:30 game, so, note that if you want to watch it. The line is Illinois by 2.5. The Illini were riding high at 6-1 before losing their last two games to number 1 Oregon and also to Minnesota, which knocked the Illini out of the top 25. Illinois had a bye week last week and should be prepared for this one. By contrast, Sparty lost to rival Michigan and number 5 Indiana the past two games. The Spartans are still hoping to make a bowl with games against league punching bag Purdue and also a struggling Rutgers team to end the season. Illinois' offense struggled in its last two losses, scoring just 26 points total. That's what they are averaging per game, so to get that in 2 games was pretty rough. Illinois QB Luke Altmaier needs to bounce back after 2 turnovers against Minnesota. That said, in his defense, those turnovers were fumbles caused by sacks, and those are just as much on the O-line as on Altmaier. Illinois' offensive line has been a weak point all year, which is surprising because before the season, Brett Bielema said that they quote, had the horses up front, close quote. And it just seems like they don't. And the Illinois offensive line has just not, produced at the level that you expect a Brett Bielema offensive line to produce at. So that's been as good as Illinois has been, and they've been pretty good. That's been when they've had trouble. That's been a weak point for them. Illinois QB Luke Altmaier is still having a pretty decent year despite his recent struggles in the last 2 games with nearly 2,000 yards passing on 63% completions, 16 TDs to just 3 interceptions. So Altmaier's been a nice surprise this year. Frankly, I wasn't a big believer in Altmaier going into the year based on his play last year, but he's really improved a lot. And he has given the Illini a chance to win in, more often than not. The run game has been somewhat lackluster all year behind that weak O-line, and Illinois will rise and fall with Altmaier and top receiving targets Pat Bryant and Zachary Franklin. The two have combined for 9 touchdowns and over 1,000 yards receiving this season. Sparty needs to get the ball to Frosh Phenom wide receiver Nick Marsh, who has nearly 600 yards receiving on the year and 3 TDs. So I think a lot of Saturday comes down to Michigan State QB Aiden Childs. Childs has had moments of brilliance on this season, but he's also struggled with 11 interceptions to just 8 touchdowns and 21 sacks. Yikes. So that's not great. And Sparty needs to do a better job of protecting Childs if they're going to win this game. I'm really tempted to pick Michigan State here because I feel like first-year coach Jonathan Smith is doing a good job, and DC Joe Rossi has done some big things this year, including shutting down star Iowa running back Caleb Johnson in their upset win over the Hawkeyes. But I'm not sure that either team can run the ball. So that means it comes down to who passes better. And I just trust Illinois and Luke Altmaier more than I trust Michigan State and Aiden Childs. Aiden Childs can do amazing things. The dude is crazy talented. He's probably going to be an incredible QB next year or the year after, stuff like that. But right now, along with all the brilliant plays and the big throws, he just makes a lot of mistakes. And that has doomed Sparty quite often this year. So I think we see Childs throw a couple picks, which will give the Illini short fields to work with. I expect Illinois to be motivated in this one and to play well. It also helps that Illinois is coming off of a bye week. So I have the Illinois Illini 28, the Michigan State Spartans 17. Next up, we have the number 4, 8-1 Penn State Nittany Lions going to West Lafayette to take on the 1-8 Purdue Boilermakers. This is a 2:30 p.m. game on CBS. Cue the horns. The line is Penn State by 28.5. I'm not going to talk a lot about this game. Purdue is painfully bad outside of their close overtime losses against Northwestern and Illinois. There's been a glimmer of hope in those games, but otherwise the Boilermakers have been absolutely abysmal, and their only win so far this year has come against a bad FCS team. By contrast, Penn State has been lights out on defense and pretty good, although somewhat inconsistent on offense. Let me ask if you've heard this before. A James Franklin team is fantastic on defense, but is inconsistent on offense. It is a tale as old as time. All right, QB Drew Aller is having a really nice year for Penn State, completing 70% of his passes for 13 TDs and just 5 picks. He hasn't been the big-time playmaker downfield that Penn State had hoped for, and that was abundantly clear against Ohio State as PSU didn't score an offensive touchdown in that game. That said, I don't think it's entirely his fault. His wide receivers have not played well. No one has stepped up to be a top 1 or 2 wide receiver on this team other than tight end Tyler Warren. And while Tyler Warren is fantastic, it's been him carrying the passing game mostly by himself. So I think, that is something we have to watch this game to see if anyone else steps up at wide receiver for Penn State, against a pretty bad Purdue defense. Maybe the receivers can have a little more success. Maybe they don't have to ride Tyler Warren quite as hard as they normally do. The Nittany Lions throttled Washington last week. And let's be real, Purdue ain't Ohio State. I mean, Purdue isn't even Washington. The Boilermakers ranked just 127th out of 133 FBS teams in scoring offense, while Penn State ranks 8th nationally in scoring D. I predict that Penn State pulls off a shutout in emphatic fashion. So I have the Penn State Nittany Lions 34, the Purdue Boilermakers 0. All right, next up is the game that we featured on the thumbnail because I think it's the most intriguing game of the week, to be honest. We've got the 5-4 Nebraska Cornhuskers going to SoCal to take on the 4-5 USC Trojans. This is a 3 p.m. game on Fox. The line is USC by 7.5. The good news for Nebraska is that Frosh QB Dylan Raiola is expected to play on Saturday. The bad news is that he played in the last 3 games, and Nebraska didn't play very well offensively en route to 3 consecutive losses against Indiana, Ohio State, and most damning, UCLA. The D was pretty good against Ohio State in a game where the Buckeyes were struggling with their O-line personnel. But the D also got eviscerated by Indiana and wasn't great against UCLA. The issue Nebraska has is that they need to find some offense. QB Dylan Raiola is completing 65% of his passes, but he has 8 picks to go with 10 TDs. That's not great. He's also missed open receivers at key points in all 3 of his losses. And also, his receivers have struggled to create separation downfield. They are big receivers. They can make contested catches, but they're not always open. And that's been a problem for the Cornhuskers this year. Another problem for Nebraska is that they struggle to run the ball. Dante Dowdell is okay, but the rest of the backs haven't produced much, and the O-line hasn't been great. Oh, look, my microphone's falling down. That's awesome. All right. Like I said, we're kind of doing this in a makeshift setup, folks, so bear with me here. My question with you, if Nebraska is going to be in this game, they need to get their wide receivers, Nair and Banks, going, or else they won't be able to keep up with USC, period. As for USC, though, where are their heads at this point? This team beat LSU in impressive fashion to start the season, but are just 3-5 since that opening day triumph. Lincoln Riley has been unwilling to run the ball enough, despite the fact that the O-line hasn't been great in pass blocking and Woody Marks has been really good on the ground. After last game, Lincoln Riley decided to make a QB change. Miller Moss has been benched in favor of young, freakish athlete Jaden Maeva. This feels like a panic scapegoating move to me. Miller Moss is a very good QB who has suffered from poor pass blocking and inconsistent play at wide receiver. I don't see how benching him fixes either one of those problems. So where are the USC players' heads at after so many losses, after being hyped all offseason and even after the LSU game as college football playoff contenders? Do the Trojans still care? Are they still playing hard for Riley? Or have they packed it in for the year and they're already thinking about next season? I believe we're going to find that out on Saturday. That said, I suspect that at home, we see USC play pretty hard. Jaden Maeva isn't better than Moss, in my opinion, but he's different from him. And maybe that difference sparks a somewhat listless offense. Maeva has legs. He can run. He's a big, strong guy who's hard to bring down. So athletically, he is superior to Miller Moss. I don't think he's better than Miller Moss. I think benching Miller Moss is not a good move. But that, despite that, USC still has speed and weapons everywhere despite their struggles. Nebraska does not. And frankly, the Cornhuskers struggle to score points. I think the final score is the USC Trojans 27, the Nebraska Cornhuskers 16. Next up, and also let me say, if Nebraska loses this game and they drop to 5-5, they're going to have to win one of their final 2 games to get to a bowl. And if Nebraska, after starting out 5-1 or 5-2, if they collapse and fail to make a bowl game, there are going to be serious questions in Lincoln. The other thing to watch in this game is that offensive coordinator Marcus Satterfield has been replaced at Nebraska by Dana Holgorsen. Dana Holgorsen, you may remember, was the very successful head coach of the West Virginia Mountaineers for a long time, and then the less successful head coach at Houston. Holgorsen's an interesting hire. His offenses have always produced. So I can see hiring him from that perspective. And it's possible in the short run, we see much better play calling and better offensive execution from Nebraska. I think that's totally on the table. That said, wow, I've said that said a lot. I got to stop doing that. Sorry, everybody. That's what happens when you get me on an off day. Sometimes I repeat myself just a little bit. So thank you for bearing with me. That said, Dana Holgorsen is, let's just say he's not a player's coach. There's a infamous story of him. I saw an interview with one of his former players once. I can't remember the player's name, but he said that he went into Dana Holgorsen's office when he was the head coach and said, "Hey, coach, I'm having a really hard time off the field, et cetera, et cetera. I could really use some help." And Dana Holgorsen glared at him and said, "I don't have time for your problems." Yikes. So Dana Holgorsen is a very good schematic offensive mind, but he's not the kind of guy who's gonna be there for his players in an emotional way. But maybe that doesn't matter because they have Matt Rule for that, and Matt Rule very much is a player's coach. So maybe with Holgorsen limited to being offensive coordinator, the fact that he's not very personable doesn't matter as much as it did when he was a head coach. Because, when Dana Holgorsen was a head coach, he had success, but his teams were maddeningly inconsistent from week to week all the time. And I do think some of his unwillingness to be, really supportive of his players off the field probably contributed to that inconsistency. I could be wrong there, but you know what? This is a podcast. You're going to get my takes. And my take is that Dana Holgorsen is not the nicest guy to his players. But again, Matt Rule is. So maybe it doesn't matter that Holgorsen isn't much of a player's coach. So yeah, I don't think we see immediate improvement from Nebraska, but I think, the offense will look a little cleaner, maybe early in the game in particular. And you might see, a little more production than we've seen from Nebraska. But I just think this USC team needs this win. If they're going to make a bowl game, they absolutely need to win this game. So the Trojans, I think, are at home. They play better at home. I think we see them pull it out. Next up, we have the 5-4 Rutgers Scarlet Knights going to College Park to take on the 4-5 Maryland Terrapins. This is a weirdly timed 5 p.m. game on FS1. The line is Maryland by 5. Rutgers saved their season last week with a shocking upset over Minnesota. They managed that despite the fact star running back Kyle Monangai did not play. Following their upset of USC, Maryland has gotten hammered the past 2 games. And it just hasn't looked very good, particularly against Minnesota. Terps QB Billy Edwards is having a decent season, completing 66% of his passes for 2,500 yards, 14 TDs to 8 interceptions. And that's good because Maryland is not great at running the ball. Top running back Roman Hemby only has 437 yards for the year. Woof. The key to Maryland's offense are the 2 receivers, Ty Felton and Caden Prather. Ty Felton's already at about 1,000 yards, and Caden Prather is also really good. So they're having outstanding seasons. There's one thing you can count on with a Mike Locksley team. He's going to have a decent quarterback probably, and he's going to have a couple receivers on the outside with a lot of speed and talent. Rutgers needs another performance like they got in the first half against Minnesota, where QB Ethan Kaliakmanis played pretty well for a change. That said, as soon as I did it again, I said that said. Oh, Michael. As soon as Minnesota started blitzing Ethan in the second half, he came apart completely. Why did it take until the second half for Minnesota to blitz Kaliakmanis? I don't know. It was bad coaching on Corey Heatherman's part. I give him, I think that was a mistake on his part. He's been very good for Minnesota overall, but he should have blitzed Ethan from the jump. If he does, Minnesota probably wins that game going away because Rutgers needed a good D and some turnover luck to win that game. Ethan has been more bad than good in his career, and I don't ever remember him playing 2 games or even 2 halves in a row. Also, this game is in College Park. If Monangai plays this week, Rutgers has a shot. Limit possessions, run the ball, play defense. That's what Greg Schiano wants to do. But Rutgers has been inconsistent all year. That D has been porous at times, and they played their absolute best ball against Minnesota and still barely won. So I think Maryland brings Rutgers back down to earth in a close game. So I have the Maryland Terrapins 24, the Rutgers Scarlet Knights 20. All right. Last up, we have the number one team in the land, the 10-0 Oregon Ducks, heading to Madison, take on the 5-4 Wisconsin Badgers. This is a 6:30 p.m. game on NBC, or what I like to call the Here Comes Saturday Night game. You can hate on Fall Out Boy all you want as a band, but they know how to make something into a bop. And although it is a cover and they didn't write it or anything, they made it fun and upbeat. And I even just mentioning this game gets the Here Comes Saturday Night song stuck in my head. So they're doing something right. The line in this game is Oregon by 13.5. It's been a rough year for the Badgers. They haven't been consistently good on offense or defense. They lost their QB for the year in September, and backup Braden Locke just has not been great in his stead. Locke is completing just 57% of his passes and has as many TDs as interceptions on the year. Brutal. That said, Tawi Walker has been a nice find at running back. He's done a really good job since the benching of Chez Mellusi, averaging nearly 5 yards per rush. They will need Walker to have a big game if Wisconsin is going to hang with Oregon. They need to limit possessions. They need to slow this down. And most importantly, when they do get yards, they need to score touchdowns. You're not going to beat Oregon kicking field goals. You're just not. The problem with that is that Oregon ranks 9th nationally in scoring defense. So it will be tough sledding for the Badgers, even in front of the home crowd. Oregon also ranks 19th in scoring offense, scoring nearly 36 points per game. So that combination is really impressive. And Ducks QB Dillon Gabriel, man, he is having a year for the ages, completing a scorching hot 74% of his passes, nearly 9 yards per attempt, and a crazy almost 2,900 yards so far. He also has 22 TDs to just 5 interceptions. Send this man to New York. Dillon Gabriel absolutely deserves to be a Heisman finalist, and I hope he is to end the year. But it's not just the passing game for Oregon. Running back Jordan James has nearly 1,000 yards rushing on almost 6 yards per rush as well. So Oregon is balanced on offense and on defense. I think Wisconsin has the ability to make this interesting for like a quarter, perhaps aided by a scripted clock grinding scoring drive on the first series and a home crowd giving them energy on defense. But let's be real here. Oregon has been the best and most consistent team in the country. I don't see that changing this week. Wisconsin has fallen well below expectations this year. Once again, for the second year, people thought Luke Fickell was going to do big things in year one. Didn't happen. People thought Luke Fickell was going to do big things in year two. It's not happening. So there's a lot of rumors around Wisconsin that they're going to make an offensive coordinator change after the year with how bad the offense has been. But I would also point out the defense hasn't been very good either. And that's surprising for a Wisconsin program that under Jim Leonhard had a top 5 to 10 defense every single year. So you expected that level of defense from Wisconsin, which would keep them in games like this, even when they couldn't score enough points. They don't have that defense this year. They just don't. It's not anywhere near. They switched from a 3-4 to a 4-3, and so far it's not paying off. I thought that was a mistake too. They had all the personnel to run a great 3-4. The thing with Luke Fickell, and the mistake that I feel like he's made, is that he tried to change Wisconsin's identity on both sides of the ball. I understand wanting to change the offense because there had been some diminishing returns in recent years under Paul Chryst. But changing the defense was just a bad decision. They had a really good 3-4 defense with the personnel to run a 3-4 defense, but Fickell was stubborn, and he wanted to keep his same defensive coordinator who runs a 4-3. And so Wisconsin changed their entire identity on both sides of the football. And as we've seen in the past from schools like Nebraska, when you change your whole identity on both sides of the ball, sometimes it's really painful. And sometimes you don't get back to where you were before. Not saying that Fickell won't, not saying he can't. Luke Fickell could easily bounce back with a new offensive coordinator next year and play a lot better. But it's also possible that doesn't happen. So it's going to be really interesting to see. And I just wonder how much fight is left in the Badgers. They are really beaten down. They haven't been in this position, for a long time of struggling just to make a bowl game. So where's that fight in Wisconsin? Kind of like with USC. Are they still fighting for their coach? Are they still playing hard? That's something I'm going to have an eye on this week. So I have the Oregon Ducks 41, the Wisconsin Badgers 17. I think the Ducks are very close to clinching the top spot in the Big Ten title game, as their remaining 2 games are against 2 rebuilding teams in Wisconsin and Washington. It'll be fun to see Oregon against either Ohio State or upstart Indiana in that Big Ten title game. But we're a few weeks out from that. This Saturday, Oregon rolls over Wisconsin to take the next step on their undefeated journey. All right. So thank you all for watching and listening. When it's just me, it turns out I can only talk to myself for so long. So this is not, was never going to be a long podcast, but I will have, John will be back to do the review episode. And next week we will likely, I haven't clinched it yet, but there's a good chance we will have a guest host for the preview episode next week. So it won't just be me talking to myself. You'll be able to hear some back and forth. So that'll be good. As much as I like doing solo pods and I love all of you desperately, it's, it is a little more compelling when there's 2 of us for sure. I understand that. All right. Please, 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 if you've made it this far, subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. Even if you consume it on an audio platform like Spotify, Apple Podcast, or Podcast Addict, subscribing to the pod on YouTube and leaving comments is the best way to help us grow the pod. So please do that. And I'm also really grateful for the people who listen and comment almost every week. I had somebody reach out to me. I've had people reach out to me on Twitter also. So we appreciate you. And if you want to connect with me on Twitter, my handle is Alibaba26. That's AHLIBOBWA26 on Twitter. AHLIBOBWA26 on Twitter. So hit me up for any comments or requests. I love getting feedback, whether it's positive or negative. All of it helps the show. All of it helps us get better. And we want to make the best show possible for you so you all can enjoy it. So yeah, please hit me up. Let me know what you think, what you want. If you have a request for something you'd like to see on the pod, just tell us. We've had requests this season of things people want to see, and we usually put it in the next episode. So that's something we're happy to do. And, like I said, we love getting feedback. It's already excited for football tonight and tomorrow. And John and I will be back on Monday with the review pod for week 12. So thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you next time. Have a great football weekend.